Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series. My name is Elre Henriksen, and I will be your host for our webinar this evening. Peaceprojects.eu is proud to present Peaceprojects.eu, a Ministry of Community of Christ Europe, is proud to present Peaceful Humanity, a New Creation, the 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series. And a warm welcome to Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who is talking today on Leo Tolstoy's political thought. We just want to announce the next webinar on Sunday, the 27th of September, with Steve Veazey, President of Community of Christ. He will be addressing the theme of the whole series, Peaceful Humanity, a New Creation. Please note, this is a Sunday and not a Thursday as we normally do. For this series of webinars, we have a model with 7 dimensions of peace that we want to share at the beginning of every webinar, illustrating the ways through which each presentation touches upon a dimension of peacemaking. I will now pass over to Andrew Bolton to host this evening webinar.
I want to echo Elre's warm welcome to all of you joining us from many different parts of the world. Thank you for being with us. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Alexandre Christoyannopoulos. He has a Greek dad, hence the long name, and a French mum. And they were both European Union civil servants who met in Brussels. Alex has lived in the UK for over 2 decades. He speaks Greek, French, some Spanish and Portuguese, and English. Now, he's humble about his English, but a real test is writing in the language. I bear testimony that he writes beautiful English better than mine. His dad to 2 little children, and they're in the midst of adopting kittens, and his wife is French. His PhD was on Christian Anarchism. He loves Tolstoy, and just last year published a book on him. He teaches politics and international relations at Loughborough University. And then the important thing is his favorite food is everything his Greek grandmother used to cook. Why have him participate in the Peace Colloquy? His book on Christian Anarchism, and I'm holding it up for you to see it here. This book is inspiring. And Jewel and I had lunch with him last year, or maybe it was December 2018, here in Leicester. It was one of the best lunches of the year for conversation. Leo Tolstoy is perhaps the most inspiring of all the Christian anarchists. And when Community of Christ began in the 1830s, we were also Christian anarchists. And so given our developing peace mission, it might be good to reconnect with our early Christian anarchism. Alex will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll be open for questions. And as Elre has already indicated, please write your question or questions as they occur to you in the chat box and send them to Elre. This enables even the shyest among you to ask a question. It also means we don't interrupt the speaker. Alex, thank you so much for being willing to share your time and expertise for the 6th presentation on this first online European Peace Colloquy. A very warm welcome. Your audience is diverse and international, with an interest in peace and justice, and there are approaching 100 people listening to us already. We now look forward to your presentation, Leo Tolstoy's Political Thought. And if you're not sure who Leo Tolstoy is, you have a treat in store for you. He's perhaps the greatest novelist of all time. And he inspired Gandhi right at the beginning of Gandhi's discovery of nonviolent resistance in South Africa. What makes Tolstoy's political thought so interesting and so important for those of us interested in peacemaking in our troubled world? That's the question before you. And now over to you, Alex. You have about 25 minutes.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I've got some slides. I hope they're there. You can see everything right. I can see a few thumbs up. I do have two kids. They're eating downstairs. They're gonna hit bedtime about when we finish. So if they barge in, that's not why I located the door there, but you might have a BBC interruption moment. Okay, so I want to talk to you about Leo Tolstoy's political thought, and in a sense, what I can only do is provide a quick overview of some of the main themes that I develop in the book on Leo Tolstoy's political thought, which was just mentioned. Now, Leo Tolstoy's political thought is barely known these days, despite it having had pretty large reputation, pretty high notoriety when he passed away in 1910. When you read him, he doesn't leave you indifferent. He has a way of provoking you and provoking thought, which is always perhaps that little bit too extreme, but at the same time triggers you to reflect on the themes that he touches on. And he couches that political thought in Christian vocabulary and Christian references. But one of the things I want to argue, and I argue in the book, is that I think he partly uses this vocabulary somewhat tactically, as in he is an awkward Christian, and I'll get to that in a little bit. What you have there on the slide is basically the structure of the book. It's structured around 5 main chapters: Tolstoy's pacifism, Tolstoyan anarchism, anticlericalism, asceticism, and activism. And in each chapter, I first spend perhaps about half of the chapter developing Tolstoy's argument, the main things he says about that theme. Then I discuss a bit some of the criticisms that have been leveled either directly at Tolstoy or at the kind of argument that Tolstoy makes. And then I try to reflect kind of beyond Tolstoy's context on perhaps the impact he's had since then, or the impact you could say he may have, or the way in which he might speak to us today outside his particular context. And what I have on this slideshow is basically just a slide for each of these 5 with a summary of the main subheadings, if you want, in the book. So I'm going to quickly go through these because, and hopefully you'll be triggered into being more interested in some of them, but inevitably I can't do that in huge depth in 20-25 minutes. So before I actually go through these 5, just a few words of introduction, and that is the structure of the introduction in the book. I explain a bit Tolstoy's context, the fact that he had an aristocratic education. I suppose he learned as much from studying books as he did from studying society, and his perceptiveness about human relations is one of the things that comes through so forcefully, so compellingly in his literature, of course. He did complete army service in what is today's Chechnya and in the Crimean War, a rather brutal war at that. He traveled across Europe, tried various pedagogical experiments, and throughout this was accumulating a suspicion that what is referred to as civilization is problematic because there's a lot of misery generated by it. But it's in the 1870s that this kind of hit home into a long depression, I think it's fair to describe it as, where Tolstoy is searching for the meaning of life. He has an existential crisis, and it does last essentially, several years, until he has what he describes later on in his confession as a breakthrough. Now, how much of a break that really is, some of his biographers contest. But he certainly describes it as a break. There's a big debate as to the extent to which there really are continuities in Tolstoy, or, he's a new man, as it were, after 1879 for the last 30 or so years of his life. Whether or not there really is a break, he certainly acquires a new reputation with what he's going to go on to write, his political and religious thought for the last 30 or so years of his life. He describes himself as a Christian. He uses Christian vocabulary, but his Christianity is an awkward one, as I said before. It's one that fuses elements that we will be familiar with in Christianity with reason and rationality. He never had been particularly religious prior to this conversion. For him, several scriptures and dogmas were always difficult to believe. And he, over time, moves towards seeing, an essential similar core across all religious traditions, a kind of syncretistic move that quite a few others did in his period, of course. I describe in the book Tolstoy's metaphysics as deistic. He uses Christian terminology, but with a meaning that's very heavily rationalistic and focused on morality. We can develop that later if you want to. Ultimately, though, he uses that Christian vocabulary, but with a political purpose. His primary concern is political. He uses that religious vocabulary in order to draw attention to questions that I would call political in the broadest possible sense of politics. So he is, first of all, a pacifist. It's his pacifism that leads him to his anarchism, his anticlericalism, etc. He takes his cue from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and in particular the counsel to turn the other cheek, which he blends in his interpretation to some extent with Jesus' advice not to judge one another, to love our enemies, etc. So various elements of the Sermon on the Mount. It's not that he necessarily just follows that and that alone. That really is a trigger for him to reflect on violence, the role of violence, the impact of violence. And I summarize in the book there being kind of 10 ethical arguments he articulates about violence based on these reflections he makes on Jesus. And very quickly, violence causes harm. As such, that's a problem. It amounts to slavery. There's no universal criterion for what is right or wrong, he says, and therefore using violence to apply to what one thinks is right is potentially problematic. I'll come back to that. One other problem is if you use violence for something that you think is right, it's difficult not to consent to others using violence themselves for what they think is right. Violence depraves the perpetrator, it brutalizes the perpetrator. As I said, it might be misjudged, yet it can't. Once you've done the damage, the violence cannot be undone. It aggrieves victims and sympathizers who themselves will seek revenge potentially. It provides a pretext for a clampdown against dissidents. It pushes neutrals away. And if it teaches one thing, it's not that the thing for which violence was used was right, but it teaches that violence is one way of getting one's way. All of these are problems with violence. For Tolstoy, Jesus preaches and enacts an alternative, which is to forgive, to go further. It's a response that cultivates forgiveness rather than resentment and dehumanization. It's about reciprocity, about the golden rule, treating each other with love and forgiveness in the hope that others will do the same, including those who might have been inclined to violence. And he thinks and hopes that this is contagious and can be. Just as violence is contagious, so can love and forgiveness be. Briefly, Tolstoy doesn't preach passivity, but non-violent resistance, or Jesus-like resistance anyway, up to, I suppose, the example of the overturning of the tables. But we can come back to that later. Now, there's various criticisms of that kind of, let's call it an absolute pacifism, perhaps. It's been called utopian. People say Jesus didn't mean it literally. For Tolstoy, Jesus clearly calls for it. It's quite clear. It's repeated again and again. That's just a non-starter as far as he's concerned. He has some fantastic quotes about that. To those who say, what about children and who are under attack or foreign invaders, a classic thing leveled at pacifists, of course, and an important question, obviously. Well, here his response, I think it's fair to say, doesn't really brush off every hesitation we may have. Because first of all, one of the points provocatively that he makes is that he's not necessarily sure the victim is worth more than the perpetrator. Now that sounds horrible, but for all you know, I guess if I try and speak for Tolstoy, the child could be called Adolf Hitler, you just don't know. Now, that's a problematic claim to make, and on that basis, you don't just kind of win hearts and minds to Tolstoy's philosophy, of course. The point I want to say, though, is that Tolstoy is very well aware of violence, the violence of the attacker, the violence of foreign invaders, and he precisely wants to eradicate it. The question is how. And he thinks there are options between capitulation and violence, and those options offer a variety of possibilities. He also makes the point that those kinds of scenarios are rather rare, and yet the structures, the political structures we put in place to authorize people to inflict violence on others, because of the fear of such scenarios, those structures commit violence much more frequently than those foreign invaders really actually materialize, or the violence against children, I suppose. Now, I could go on. He doesn't really deal with it entirely and completely, and he is an extreme pacifist, but he does have, I suppose, answers to provide to that kind of challenge. Now, there are other things I discuss in the book. There are claims that, this kind of pacifism is a kind of masochism because it's mass suicide. It leads to humanity being wiped out, or the good people in it being wiped out. That only works, of course, though, if you don't buy Tolstoy's argument, which he very much puts forward, which is that people will be moved by that violence. So you only get the suicide of all the good if that act doesn't convert evildoers, let's keep it simple and dualistic, to a change of heart. He doesn't agree that violence is part of human nature. Non-violence or peace is just as much a part of human nature, and it is interesting that violence doesn't come naturally to soldiers. It needs to be drilled into them. That's what military training is for. It's not that easy, that natural, that comfortable for a human being to kill another. If anything, there's an inclination against it. Tolstoy's pacifism beyond its context, well, he has a place in the pacifist canon. He was noted at the time and as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't get it for various reasons, including his anarchism and his anticlericalism, but he certainly was a notorious pacifist. He influenced Gandhi, of course, as we've already said. I think what he says and what some people have argued is that he kind of frees pacifism from a religious encasing. Awkwardly, even though he uses Christian vocabulary, the way he speaks liberates the kind of arguments he makes beyond just the confines of Christianity. And with Tolstoy, you have one of the first voices that preaches pacifism without being necessarily confined to a particular religious tradition. That's one argument anyway. The kind of ethics he preaches might inspire non-Christians and deists today, but of course what he says is supposed to speak to Christians today as well. And to that extent, it still resonates with us. He wants to open our eyes to violence. Reading him, I think, helps us awaken ourselves to the violence that we all perpetrate against one another. And briefly in the book, I argue that his thought kind of anticipates more recent scholarship and practice in social psychology, criminology, pedagogy, even feminism, but that's not something I can really develop here to a great extent. So I spent a fair bit of time on his pacifism because it's the ground upon which he develops his anarchism. More quickly then on this, even though it's a bit meatier, but for Tolstoy, state violence is incompatible with pacifism to the extent that the state is the monopoly over allegedly legitimate uses of violence in any particular territory. That state needs to be rejected. He wants to reject coercion, the coercion and the deception of the state. So obviously he rejects war and militarism and imperialism. He's critical of legislation as a form of coercion and enslavement. He's critical of capital punishment. He's critical of the judicial system. He argues we're all sinful. We shouldn't be judging one another for other people's sins. We should look at our own first. He doesn't think that the burglar being put through the criminal system is any worse than the legally rich, those who exploit the masses, but through legal means. He also has arguments about what you might call, and I call in the book, economic enslavement. He's critical of the way in which plenty of land is seized by the wealthy and then protected by the state, held against starving farmers who could very well use that land for their own well-being, obviously, as well as for the land itself, I should say, I guess. He's critical of wage slavery, which he thinks is no better than chattel slavery. And he's critical of the division of labor to the extent that it is imposed. If it was free, that's fine, but it isn't. It's imposed and policed by the state. He thinks that the state is no better than a glorified protection racket, a bit like the mafia. It's seized by the most cunning. It corrodes the moral compass present in us all. He's critical of hypocritical elite gestures, treaties that are supposed to be for peace, never really hang for very long. Those alliances for peace are usually alliances for war. He's critical of those. He's very critical of the evasion of responsibility built into the division of labor of the state. It allows us all to think that someone else is responsible for the violence that we, at least in part, as a cog, contribute to. We get intoxicated by our professional duty, and that's partly deliberate, partly not, but either way, he's critical of that. He's very critical of patriotism, who he thinks there's no good version of patriotism. He thinks it's used to deliberately inflame the masses. It's egged on by violence. It diverts resources. It's problematic in all sorts of ways. He's critical of education at the time, which he thinks is deliberately designed to mold innocent children into instruments for everything I've just listed, all the problems we've just gone through. And for him, well, he preaches an anarchistic alternative. He really, admires the life of Russian peasants at the time, the virtues of manual labor. And to use one only quote, my anarchism is the application of Christianity to human relations, he would say. And that is a form of anarchism. He sees the Christian way of life, as preached by Jesus in that pure form, as a form of anarchism. To those who might say, yeah, that's fine, but some states are good. They administer public goods, and the state is more complex today. You have the welfare state and whatnot. That's true enough, and perhaps also would moderate his criticism. I can't really speak for him or guess what he would say, but it's worth noting that state violence is still a daily occurrence. It hasn't gone away. Other things to say there, but because of time, I'm not going to elaborate too much. Those who say that we need the state to protect us from evil maybe aren't paying attention at the plenty of evil that is committed through the arms of the state. Once you have a structure like the state, who's to say that the people who take control of it are the better people among us? But you have that structure, though, and it can be abused. So he's critical of those kinds of arguments. Criminality isn't prevented. The current order is a form of theft. The wicked already dominate the good, etc. To those who say that anarchism is not really realistic today, perhaps numerous communities have tried, though, and keep trying, and at the very least they help foster our imagination to try and think beyond the shackles of an order that is heading to ecological disaster in the midst of a pandemic and other depressing things we can read into the tragedies of today. So maybe at least he offers us hope in an alternative and points in a direction. Like others, he's not the only one, of course. And so he fits the anarchist canon. He's an awkward anarchist because he's a Christian anarchist, and most anarchists are not religious. In fact, they're anti-religious. But he is one among them. He certainly is an anarchist when it comes to his politics. And he wants us to focus on the violence of the globalized political economy, or let's say it differently. I think with him we can look at today's global political economy and unhide the violence in it, the violence that's widespread, the technologies of war, the way in which law is a form of violence, the judicial system and all its unfairness, no better than then, the unequal economy, the way governing elites take the mickey, to be slightly colloquial, etc. And also it's about us admitting moral responsibility for the acts that are perpetrated through us and with our help, either our professional help, as in the jobs that we do, or as consumers or whatnot. But it's about owning up to what we actually do, I suppose, to one another. Now, that's all really brief, and there's a lot more that I can expand if you want later on. I'm not going to spend time on this particular slide. There is a chapter on his anticlericalism. It's interesting. If you want, we can discuss it briefly later on. I'll just quickly go through the fact that, Tolstoy's condemnation of the church is quite strong. He criticizes the creeds, he criticizes the rituals. He thinks the message of the church was to preach Jesus's teaching, and it failed. It has, in fact, suffocated it. It brushes it away, and therefore it's a very guilty failure, let's say. To those who say that his Christianity is quite abnormal, that's true enough. He perhaps overemphasizes morality over metaphysics, but perhaps his critics are a bit too quick to disemphasize morality in favor of metaphysics. We can go into that a little later if you want, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend much longer on that here. Equally, on his asceticism, I'm not going to say much, but I had to include in the book, for those who are familiar with Tolstoy, some discussion of his views on sex and marriage, because they are, let's say, quite different politically on the political compass to everything I've said so far. They're an awkward mixture of really progressive and severely conservative, I suppose. But I discussed that briefly there. I discuss his theory of art. Of course, he describes, I think, his earlier novels as dog's vomit. He rejects what he had written because he thinks it's not something that, I suppose, leads those who read towards the path that he thinks matters. So I discuss that briefly in there, and I also go a bit on about why he preaches various forms of self-control against what he sees as intoxicating luxuries, the pleasures of the flesh, alcohol, sugar, coffee, gambling, feasting, that are all built on economic exploitation, that generate emotions in us that are intoxicating and take our attention away from the stuff that matters as far as he's concerned. So it's a form of escapism, Epicureanism that he's critical of. I develop in the book criticisms of his views on sex and marriage, criticism of his views on art, criticisms of that kind of self-denial. I can't do that in huge detail here. But in the end, I argue that he invites us to think about those distractions. He invites us to think, I think, about gender politics to some extent. And of course, he was one of the first notorious vegetarians. So he's a forerunner of vegetarianism. And I briefly go into that. Now, before I carry on much further, how much time have I got left? 10 minutes. Okay, so I don't need to speed it up, but I can, if anything, slow down a little bit. His activism. Tolstoy's activism, maybe that's not the best term, but it's a way of, it's trying to focus on what he says we should do instead of what he says about the world already, which is what comes in his pacifism and anarchism. The first point to make is that he insists that we have got to resist any temptation to compromise with violence, both as revolutionaries or dissenters and as the state, or as people who consent to that violence being applied against others as citizens of a particular polity. So this is something he preaches not just to dissenters and revolutionaries, but also to those who work for the status quo, for the arms of the state, etc. We've got to stop using violence against one another if we want violence not to be used unfairly against others. It's kind of as simple as syllogistic as that. And therefore, he's critical of the revolutionaries of the time, but he's also preaching withdrawal from any military service, non-cooperation with the judicial system, with the police, with tax collection, and he advocates a form of cooperative bread labor. The expression bread labor isn't his, it comes later, but he advocates physical work as a source of health and self-sufficiency. He admires Russian agricultural communes, as I said before. He, for a while, admires the life of monasteries, in, I suppose, a pure kind of version anyway. But he's ambivalent on communities that are withdrawn from the rest of society. He thinks it's important to remain connected to society and to be an example of a different way of life in society. So he preaches a form of prefigurative transformation. Anarchists use this term, prefiguration. That is, being by your action the change that you want to see, exemplifying the alternative that you are preaching. So the kind of revolution he preaches is a revolution from within you and outwards, a form of gradual awakening that leads to changed behavior of an increasing number of people. He hopes and thinks that this is and can be contagious, a form of transformation that spreads like ripples by the moving example of, to begin with, a few and onwards. I have a brief section in the book, I'm not going to elaborate that here, on his views on history. That's partly because if you have read War and Peace, you will know that he frames it as a critique of understandings of history at the time. And I argue that the view he comes to in his political thought later on is actually compatible with his view on history earlier on, but I'm not going to expand on that here. His own example, well, he was plagued by chronic guilt. He was, of course, an aristocrat. His wife carried on cooking his meals right until his death. And so in many ways, you could argue he was a hypocrite. At the same time, he did engage in manual labor. He dressed like a peasant, worked in the fields. He built his own shoes. He adopted an ascetic lifestyle. He stopped eating meat. He stopped hunting, and he loved that before. He stopped alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea. He refused Jewish service. He worked, he worked, what's the word I'm looking for? He worked relentlessly for famine relief when a great famine hit Russia in the late 19th century. One of his biographers describes him as a one-man Oxfam at the time, providing the kind of relief that the state was failing to provide at the time. And he renounced his royalties for everything written after 1881. He kept writing because he was aware that it was having an echo. And therefore, although there were important tensions with his family, and they're notorious and films have been made about them, and especially with his wife, these tensions, it's important to note, are about his estate and precisely caused by his desire to live a life that's more closely aligned with what he's preaching, which was resisted by his wife, his family, for reasons we might understand. But that, and his guilt, his own moral masochism, caused the kind of tension he had with his wife. Nevertheless, he might have failed in living up to this example, but he tried, at least to a significant extent. Now, some people argue that nonviolent activism is ineffective. That's not the way you change the world. It just doesn't work. And absolute non-resistance, not non-violent resistance, but absolute non-resistance has very little traction in, among the people who want to see the world improved. Lenin at the time and various revolutionaries in Russia dismissed Tolstoy as foolish and dangerous. Various reformers did too. And there is a criticism among revolutionaries. There's an argument penned by Murray Bookchin, I think it was a few decades ago, framing revolutionaries as either working for change through syndicalism and labor struggles, or as lifestylists, people who think they can change the world just by their lifestyle. And the lifestylism is used as kind of an insult, and I suppose it would apply to Tolstoy. Yet there is mounting evidence that nonviolent tactics are effective. An important study, I have it somewhere else, by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan has made a lot of noise over the last 9 years since it's been published, because it basically shows that although both violent and non-violent tactics fail more often than they succeed in getting change, non-violent tactics fail less often than violent tactics. In fact, they work about twice as often as violent tactics do. And they come to this conclusion through, looking at some 300 or so struggles over the last century. It's not ineffective. It's effective, and it might be effective because of some of the reasons that Tolstoy had put his fingers on. Non-violent attempts to change things might mean violence is inflicted against you, but you're not committing violence, and that might help regime backers change allegiance. They see the commitment you have to the cause, and they see that you are willing to suffer in the process, and that makes it jar. It makes them rethink their support for that system. Violence leads to the withdrawal of public consent. The public is more likely to consent to the validity of a cause if non-violent tactics are used, and so on. So it's not ineffective. There are those who argue that non-violent activism has dubious origins and consequences. This kind of lumps together a number of different criticisms, which I'm not going to go into, apart from labeling them here, which is, that pacifism is a form of bourgeois posturing. Maybe it is, but it's not. But that's not necessarily easy for that. Some argue it concedes the monopoly of violence to the state. Well, Tolstoy doesn't. Some argue it's a form of collective suicide. As I said before, that only is true if it doesn't change the heart of those who observe, and yet evidence suggests it can do, and so on. And then those who argue that Tolstoyan examples, Tolstoyan colonies, etc., prove that Tolstoyism cannot work. Well, it's true that a number of people did kind of drop everything and try to live as Tolstoy argued, and many of these colonies did collapse. But then Tolstoy didn't really provide much guidance to these colonies. What he writes really is kind of high abstract principles, I suppose, and that's perhaps a problem. But that doesn't mean that those principles are wrong. It just means that he didn't provide much of a blueprint for the kind of colonies who in his name tried to live up to that example. And Tolstoy certainly did have an impact at the time, and even experiments that fail in alternative ways of living don't leave those who have lived through them with no experience or no reflection on how to continue thinking about how to improve society, I suppose. In terms of nonviolent activism, still Tolstoy, well, he has inspired many. We talked about Gandhi already. There are many others. He makes a theoretical contribution to nonviolence, which I elaborate in the book. Taking a Tolstoyan stance today probably means thinking about our role as producers. That is what we do in our job. Our role as consumers, our role as citizens, and in the micro-political encounters of everyday life. It's something I develop in a short piece for the conversation, which I can post a link to later on if you want. But I suppose with Tolstoy, we can try and look forward to a greener way of life. And that's what he argued for already. It's been argued by many more since, but at the very least, what he says is in harmony with deep green thought, with what Ellul will come to sort of say later on, with various intentional communities as well. So to conclude, Tolstoy is an eccentric, and yet he was widely read at the time. He had a considerable following. His death, the saga around his passing away, with him falling ill at this remote train station, Astapovo, and then passing away about a week later, was one of the first global media events. It was followed quite widely, and he did contribute to subvert the regime at the time. Someone described Tolstoy as of equal power and authority as the Tsar at the time, and the thorn on the Tsar's side. He genuinely was widely read, but his political thought faded away, and it faded away partly deliberately by the Soviet regime reframing his reputation as a split reputation. Tolstoy, a great thinker, a great writer, a great patriot, but a great writer, not a great thinker, but a wacky thinker later on in his life, someone who was clearly a bit more deranged and who shouldn't be looked at for his latter thoughts. That's his reputation, according to the Soviet Union, and it kind of percolates out, and it certainly percolates in within the Soviet Union. And so his religious and especially his political views are often widely dismissed, and yet I think they're worth engaging with. They certainly make you think about the various issues he writes about. In terms of whether to label him a pacifist, an anarchist, a Christian, it's tricky, and I discussed that briefly in there. In many of these labels apply, and yet at the same time, he's too radical for them. I think one way of describing him is as an iconoclast, the iconoclastic gadfly that Socrates wanted to be. He's iconoclastic as a Christian, as an anarchist, and as a pacifist, both in being a Christian, an anarchist, and a pacifist, and as an anarchist, a Christian, and a pacifist. He's iconoclastic for each of those categories. So taking him seriously today, I think it's possible. He might not provide much concrete guidance for concrete questions, but he does call for an awakening, and he stirs reflection on issues of violence, on questions about political and religious structures and how they're organized, on our political and personal choices, and on the way we do our own activism and try and change the world. And so given the global political economy today, the direct and indirect violence we see in it, given the threats to security we face, from terrorism all the way to weapons of mass destruction, given both the structural and the direct violence that is tied to ecological collapse, which is fast approaching, it's well worth, I think, engaging with Tolstoy when we're pondering our choices and our contributions, direct and indirect, to the world that surrounds us.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. El Rey will be collecting questions right now. Let me just start with one. Anarchists say that governments are part of the problem. They're often violent, unjust, and on the side of the rich and powerful. So how do we get to know government non-violently? What's Tolstoy's road to get there?
Well, Tolstoy's road is perhaps a hopeful one, but it's not one that takes the reins of political power in order to get change, because that only inflicts further violence, and it's just a change in the palace guards. You still have the palace. His route for change is through prefigurative transformation. He hopes that by enough people behaving as Christians, he would say, following the example of Jesus, of loving and forgiving one another, of caring for one another, of and this is where he might inject a bit of his own thought as well, of course, but of tilling the land, working to grow the food that we eat, etc. All these things I described, he hopes are contagious and will convert others to doing the same. And so we subvert the state by becoming the shell of a new society within the old, to use a classic anarchist saying, by being the change we want to see and hoping that that develops an alternative form of relations between people that renders the state irrelevant. That means we don't pay attention to it, that we ignore it, we don't count on it, and we don't depend on it. So we become an alternative society through example, I think, is the short version of an answer to that, Andrew.
Here are some of the additional questions that have come in, Alexander, and I will start with one here that we've all seen. What modern expression of the Tolstoy tradition through Gandhi and Martin Luther King would you cite? Including, are there any Tolstoy farm experiments that have reached to the present?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't think there are sort of pure examples of that. You do find little pockets of people who describe themselves as Tolstoyans. My colleague, what's her first name? Gordieva is her second name. She's working on, she's uncovered a small community of Tolstoyans that somehow survived in Russia, but they've become, I suppose, more, you might call them hippies than Tolstoyans, strictly speaking. There are a couple of communities in the UK. There's one in, I forget the name now, and I shouldn't be forgetting, it's somewhere in Yorkshire. It was a Tolstoyan community. They still aspire to, they appreciate Tolstoy's writings, but I think it's a stretch too far to describe them as Tolstoyans, strictly speaking. And so I don't think you find sort of pure Tolstoyans today, because I don't think it's that realistic an expectation almost. Nevertheless, what you do find is the influence of Tolstoy through various currents and traditions. Now, these are not necessarily major currents and tradition, but they're significant nonetheless. Of course, there's Gandhi, who he exchanges letters with. Now, Gandhi isn't Tolstoy. Gandhi, in a way, operationalizes Tolstoy's thought and converts it into political strategy. And he doesn't do it just with Tolstoy in mind. He blends other sources, of course, as well. But that eventually, it does inspire many others. Tolstoy is someone, I think, who people read to think critically about a number of issues, but not necessarily someone who people follow sort of heart and soul and would necessarily label themselves as Tolstoyan, strictly speaking. So, yeah, you do find examples of, I suppose, the Catholic worker communities. There are examples of Christian anarchism in action, in a sense. But that doesn't mean that they take their cue only from Tolstoy or even from Tolstoy mainly. So I don't think there are pure Tolstoyans in a sense, but you find sort of echoes of Tolstoy through strands of political thought, to particular forms of activism, to particular ways of living, I think, in alternative communities today. I think that's the fairest response to that.
Mm. So you would say that, for example, you said that rather than forming communities apart from society, Tolstoy would prefer be active in society and be living examples of the change we hope to see. So what might some of those examples look like today then? An idea that came to mind was cooperatives, but do you have anything else?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, one of the causes he campaigned for quite vociferously was conscientious objection to compulsory military service. Now, here in the UK, military service isn't compulsory anymore, but in many places it still is. So at the very least, he would call for that. So withdrawal from military service. And therefore that call that he had, is still live today. Fundamentally, he's calling for people to stop being complicit in violence. And so I don't know who wants to call me now, when you refuse to allow violence to be inflicted in your name, when you choose not to work for the marketing wing of a military company, but instead deploy, for example, the skills you developed at university for a different kind of area of production, different enterprise, when you consume products that are not built, at least in part, through violence inflicted against others, when you vote for particular parties, even I'd say, who do not necessarily subscribe to violence, when your activism is focused around your pacifism, when you do all these things, you do the kinds of things that Tolstoy would preach. And so, yeah, there are many ways in which you can, I suppose, be inspired by Tolstoy in your actions today. Does that answer your question? I got a bit distracted by the phone call.
Yes, no, I think that's very good. In addition, an additional question that reflects what you just said is perhaps that Tolstoy's opposition to violence and domination included a strong opposition to violence against non-human sentient beings. Could you say a bit more about how Tolstoy's conception of Christian nonviolence crossed the species barrier of compassion?
Yes, so that's interesting, and that's something that a lot of vegetarian thinkers, I suppose, or thinkers around vegetarianism have noted, that Tolstoy is an early vegetarian, in a sense, and an early advocate of vegetarianism. And you didn't say that word, but I did. And the reason he does that, I think, is partly, as ever with Tolstoy, controversial. So there's a famous introduction. It's called The First Step. It's about 25 pages where he basically makes the case for not eating animals. And for about 20 pages of that, the case is built around what you might call a kind of classic Christian ascetic argument. And he develops, I don't know if it's classic actually, he develops the argument that eating meat awakens in us our animal instincts, instincts which he thinks are problematic because they lead to violence. He develops that kind of argument, which isn't one that a lot of vegetarians today necessarily want to subscribe to. But for the last 4 or 5 pages of that book, of that chapter, he has a stunning description of an abattoir and the violence inflicted against animals there, and it echoes the kind of critique he articulates of violence against human beings. And that is a powerful passage. And it's interesting that today, when people speak of Tolstoy's vegetarianism, when his works are cited in readers that are published, for instance, it's that selection. The whole chapter is cut to just the last bit where he criticizes the abattoir. That people prefer to ignore some of the other arguments he made for why violence against, or why eating animals is problematic. So partly it's to do then, to answer your question, the way he makes that jump, it's partly because violence is wrong, and violence against other species is no prettier than violence against human beings, especially when it's unnecessary. It's just good for the luxury of eating beef, for example, when you can perfectly eat the kind of roots that grow in the garden. That's part of it, but part of it for Tolstoy is also an argument, perhaps an eccentric one, I don't know, that eating meat awakens in us the down the road to us inflicting violence against others. Quick answer, but hopefully focused on your question.
In Christian Anarchism, people have to change. You say it's a revolution from within. Do they have to convert to the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount, for Christian Anarchism to work?
For Tolstoy, in a sense, yes. But he would argue that it's not a conversion to Christianity, it's a conversion to truth, which Jesus best articulated. So that's the way I think Tolstoy would articulate it. Equally, he was upset at people who say, that they are Tolstoyans. He say, I'm not a Tolstoyan. You should be listening to me. What I stumbled upon is the truth of the matter, and I hope everyone else can follow and do the same. So that's the way he expects. That's the way he would frame, I suppose, conversion to this. So what's the first step for him? And if I keep it perhaps a bit too simplistic, there really is just only one step, and it's to stop doing violence against one another, and therefore stop consenting to violence being done in our name, etc. And really, a lot of his argument comes down to just this, to the evil of violence. He talks about other forms of injustice, but he tends to boil them down to the question of violence, again and again. And that's why he found, Jesus' sayings in the Sermon on the Mount so particularly powerful, because they spoke to that specifically. I hope that answers that. I've just noticed a question in the chat asking what a good biography of Tolstoy is. The one I like is this one by Rosamund Bartlett, because I think it's very good at reflecting on his political thoughts, whilst also covering his life. So it's Tolstoy: A Russian Life by Rosamund Bartlett. That's the one I'd recommend. Sorry, I answered another question on my own bat there.
We like the initiative. So we're coming towards the end of our formal time. So let me try and summarize what we've been learning from you this evening, British time. So he's a serious pacifist, robustly serious, and takes Jesus very seriously. In fact, when I read recently what I believe, it's really excellent commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And he frees pacifism from the confines of Christianity, because he is saying that you can look at Jesus' teaching and apply them like Gandhi did as a Hindu. And his wanting to stop people being complicit in violence. And then his anarchism is another step on that road to stop being complicit in violence. He's suspicious about government. He sees very clearly the violence it perpetrates. Reading his confession, and he describes how you turn good farm boys into brutal soldiers by training in a year. I mean, it's gut-wrenchingly, stomach-churningly awful, but accurate, one senses. And he's both an awkward Christian and is an awkward anarchist because he combines the two. His anticlericalism, we understand that. And then he makes living simple a way forward in this journey of non-violence. And then his activism is very serious. He does try in terms of what he eats, how he dresses, how he works, the fact he gives up royalties on his books in the last part of his life, and that in his activism, he's trying to prefigure what Jesus said was the city on the hill, being the change that you want to see in society. It's a revolution within one. And he's a complicated person, plagued by guilt, awful to his wife, and yet a one-man Oxfam. So he's an intriguing conversational partner, I think, for anybody who's serious about nonviolent peace. So you've started us on a really fruitful conversation, Alex. I want to ask a question that we ask all our participants. What would you do for peace? That's the tagline of peaceprojects.eu. Can I ask you what you would do for peace?
I thought about this, and I don't know if I'm happy with this answer, but I think I still want to say it this way. What I would do is I would try to make sure that the peace I campaign for or work for or make sacrifices for is also a just peace. Because a peace that is not just might be peace, but in it are the seeds of violence, if not the continuation of injustice. So I think it's important to listen to those who express concerns about injustice, and that I think is the first thing, one of the first things anyway, to be done for peace, is to listen to those who claim they suffer or witness injustice, because without justice, peace isn't going to last.
So thank you very much.
A reminder about the next session in the series. Same time, 7 p.m. UK time, 1 p.m. Independence time, and 8 p.m. Brussels time. Is the presentation of the theme exploration, Peaceful Humanity, A New Creation, with Steve Beasy, President of Community of Christ. It's the same Zoom link and password. Thank you to Alexandre Christoyannopoulos for your presentation. And thank you to all of you who joined us on Zoom this evening or afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. And see you at the same time, but on Sunday, the 27th of September.